The chronicles don't agree on the exact night it began, only that the bells of the imperial citadel tolled 13 times, not 12, never 12. And that was the sign. Servants hiding behind tapestry folds recalled a hush sweeping through the palace like a cold wind, though no windows were open. Guards later swore the torches dimmed all at once, as if the flames themselves tried to hold their breath. By sunrise, the noblewomen of the capital would whisper a single phrase to one another, a phrase forbidden to speak above a murmur, "He has invoked the veil," and every woman of bloodline and title felt their stomach turn to stone, because the veil was not a law, it was not a ritual, it wasn't even supposed to exist. It was a punishment so disturbing, so cruelly elegant, so perfectly engineered to break those who thought themselves untouchable, that even the emperors of old swore never to use it. But one emperor did. And tonight, you're going to learn why. The empire was dying, though no one dared say it out loud. Once, the capital of Vorthalon was a marvel of polished marble and bronze, an artery where merchants, scholars, poets, and generals all pulsed with purpose. The streets had sung with the rhythm of commerce, the forums had echoed with rhetoric that shaped nations, and the aqueducts had carried water so pure that foreign dignitaries claimed it tasted of starlight. But by the reign of Emperor Thalarius IV, the streets sagged with rot. Statues cracked like old teeth, their bronze faces green with neglect. The Senate bickered like children fighting over the last sweet cake at a funeral feast. The nobles lounged in silk imported at ruinous expense, while the granaries emptied and the bread lines grew longer each morning. The provinces sent fewer taxes. The legions sent more demands. The temples sent warnings wrapped in prophecy. And above it all, the emperor sat on a throne of blackened oak, tapping the armrest with one long finger, listening. Thalarius was not a warrior emperor. He had never led a charge, never bloodied a blade in battle, never earned the devotion of his soldiers through shared hardship. He was a different breed entirely, the kind who ruled through silence, who punished through absence, who wielded paranoia like other men wielded swords. His face was pale, almost bloodless, with eyes that never quite focused on the person speaking to him. Some said he was always looking past you, searching for the knife you hadn't drawn yet. Others claimed he could hear treason in the space between heartbeats. He trusted no generals, for they commanded the loyalty of armed men, no advisors, for they whispered in too many ears, not even the noblewomen who attended the empress, laughing and gossiping in the sun-drenched courtyards, especially not them. Because in Vorthalon, the noblewomen possessed an unusual kind of political power, not through armies, not through coin, but through alliance. Single marriage could shift loyalties across entire provinces, turning a border dispute into a blood pact or transforming a trade agreement into a declaration of war. A whispered message inside a bathhouse could topple a minister, the words traveling from perfumed lips to powerful ears before the steam even cleared. A rumor planted at a feast, just a few carefully chosen words dropped like poison into wine, could turn two houses into enemies for generations. The noblewomen were the weavers of the empire's social fabric, and they knew it. They moved through the palace with the confidence of those who understood that while men held the swords, women held the threads that bound them. Thalarius despised that power. He despised the way they smiled at him, knowing he needed them. He despised their elaborate hairstyles that signaled secret allegiances. He despised their jewelry that announced marriages, alliances, political shifts, entire conversations conducted in gold and gemstones that he couldn't fully decode. And yet, he needed the noblewomen. They were the glue holding his fracturing empire together, the invisible architecture supporting a structure that would collapse without them, which meant he couldn't openly punish them. Not in public, where it would be seen as weakness, not with the lash, which would turn them into martyrs, not with exile, which would scatter their influence like seeds on the wind. He needed something quieter, something that left no bodies, no bruises, no evidence, but left behind obedience carved into the soul, a punishment that would terrify the nobles without provoking revolt, a weapon that drew no blood but left everyone bleeding inside. So he turned to the archives, descending into the library beneath the palace where the oldest texts moldered in the darkness. He read by candlelight for 7 nights, his fingers trailing across parchments that crumbled at his touch, searching through the forbidden histories that previous emperors had tried to erase. And there, in a manuscript sealed with 7 wax stamps, he found it. The veil. The old, forbidden punishment the ancestors swore to bury forever. The trouble began with a single name: Lady Seraphine Valior, daughter of General Marcus Valior, who had secured the eastern provinces through a combination of brilliant military strategy and carefully negotiated treaties. The general was old now, retired to his country estates, but his name still carried weight. His daughter had inherited his strategic mind, though she wielded it in ballrooms rather than battlefields. Seraphine was admired for her wit, feared for her political instincts, and studied by every ambitious noblewoman in the capital. She was 28 years old, unmarried by choice, and utterly magnetic. She moved through the palace like a chess master disguised in silk, always 3 moves ahead of her opponents. Her hair was dark as a raven's wing, usually adorned with silver pins that marked her as unaffiliated with any major house, a deliberate statement of independence. Her eyes were gray, the color of winter seas, and they missed nothing. She could silence a room simply by entering it. She could reshape a conversation with a single well-placed question. She could make senators believe her ideas were their own, and Thalerius hated her. Because Seraphine had influence, real influence, the kind that made senators listen and governors hesitate, the kind that couldn't be bought or threatened away. Some said she charmed people through supernatural means. Others said she manipulated them with elaborate spy networks. But the truth was far simpler. She saw through everyone. She understood the mechanics of power in a way that most people never would. She knew that influence wasn't about being the loudest voice in the room, but about being the voice that others quoted. She knew that political power flowed like water, always seeking the path of least resistance. And she had positioned herself at precisely the right elevation to direct that flow, including the emperor. She saw through him most clearly of all. She saw the paranoia eating him from the inside like rot in an apple. She saw the way he isolated himself, creating the very conspiracies he feared by treating everyone as a potential traitor. She saw the empire crumbling because its ruler was too frightened to actually rule. And that alone made her dangerous. One evening, during an imperial banquet in the Hall of Cascading Lights, Seraphine made the gravest mistake of her life. The feast had been lavish, almost desperately so, as if Thalerius could prove the empire's strength through the excess of roasted peacocks and imported delicacies. The empress, a quiet woman named Livia, who seemed perpetually exhausted, had withdrawn to a private alcove, seeking refuge from the noise and spectacle. Seraphine followed her, carrying 2 goblets of wine. They sat together on a marble bench overlooking the gardens, and for a moment they were simply 2 women tired of performance. "Your Majesty seems weary," Seraphine said gently. The Empress smiled sadly. "These banquets exhaust me. All this food while the people starve? All this pageantry while the provinces fracture?" Seraphine studied her. Livia was young, barely 25, married to Thalerius for political alliance rather than affection. She was intelligent but beaten down by years of being treated as decorative rather than consequential. Seraphine leaned a little closer, her voice dropping to barely a whisper. "Your husband won't save this empire, but you still can." It was a simple statement, an observation wrapped in possibility, but someone overheard. A minor functionary named Cassius, hovering near the alcove with a wine jug, his ears always open, his ambitions always hungry, someone eager to survive by being useful. And within hours, the emperor knew. Thalerius didn't summon Seraphine for questioning. He didn't strip her of rank. He didn't imprison her. That would have been merciful. That would have created a spectacle, turned her into a victim, given her allies something to rally around. Instead, he dismissed the court early that night, claiming illness. He retreated to his private chambers and sat in the darkness for 3 hours, tapping that long finger against the armrest of his chair, thinking. At midnight, he summoned his master of protocols, an ancient bureaucrat named Hadrian, who had served 4 emperors and kept their darkest secrets. In the flickering candlelight, Thalerius said a single phrase that chilled every official in the room. "Prepare the veil." Hadrian went pale. "Your Majesty, that punishment was forbidden generations ago. The Council of 12. The council is dead," Thalerius interrupted. "Their oaths died with them. But the precedent will be mine to set." The emperor's eyes gleamed. "You have until tomorrow night." Hadrian bowed, his hands trembling. "As you command, Your Majesty." The veil began as a myth, a cautionary tale told to young noblewomen about what happened to those who conspired against the throne. The kind of story shared in whispers during late-night gatherings, dismissed in daylight as folklore. But the reality was stranger and infinitely more unsettling. The veil wasn't torture in any traditional sense. It wasn't execution, though some argued death would have been kinder. It wasn't public humiliation, which at least ended. It was erasure, a ritualistic, psychological, and social annihilation performed entirely within the palace walls, hidden from public view, impossible to prove, and devastating in its precision. No one died, no one bled, but no one returned the same. The punishment had been developed centuries earlier by an emperor named Quintus the Thoughtful, who had been, ironically, a philosopher before ascending to power. He had studied the nature of the self, the architecture of identity, and concluded that consciousness was merely a collection of inputs, sensory data, social feedback, memories, and patterns. Remove those inputs systematically, he theorized, and you could dismantle a person more completely than any physical torture. He was right. When the veil was invoked, the condemned noblewoman would be removed from her house without force. Masked attendants would arrive with a sealed decree, and the woman would be expected to follow. No chains, no violence. The expectation of obedience was usually enough. Escorted by silent masked attendants. The masks were made of black lacquer, featureless and unsettling. The attendants never spoke, never responded, never acknowledged questions or pleas, taken to the inner halls beneath the palace. A network of chambers built during the original construction, designed for purposes lost to history. Cold stone, perfect silence, no windows. Placed into a chamber where every sensory anchor of her identity was stripped away. No mirrors, so she couldn't see herself, couldn't confirm her own existence through reflection. No voice. Not that she was gagged, but no one would respond to her words, creating the eerie sensation of speaking into an infinite void. No name. The attendants never used it, never acknowledged it. She became simply the subject. No history. Any reference to her past, her family, her accomplishments was met with blank indifference. No allies. She was utterly alone, severed from every social connection that had defined her existence. For 7 days, she lived inside a world where she was treated as if she did not exist. People walked around her as if navigating furniture. Servants never met her eyes, looking through her as if she were transparent. Food appeared on a plain wooden tray, but was never served or acknowledged, simply placed and removed. Her hair was unbound and left to fall wild, removing the elaborate styling that signaled status. Her garments were replaced with plain, nameless linen. No colors, no embroidery, nothing to distinguish her. Every question she asked melted into silence. Every demand was ignored. Every plea fell on ears that refused to hear. The chamber itself was designed to disorient. The lighting changed at irregular intervals, sometimes dim, sometimes bright, never following natural patterns. There were no clocks, no way to mark the passage of time. Meals arrived unpredictably. The temperature fluctuated just enough to prevent comfort. The air was still, creating a suffocating sensation. The walls were smooth stone, offering nothing to focus on. The purpose was cruelly simple: to dismantle the self, to strip away every layer of identity that society had built, to make a noblewoman forget she ever held power, ever mattered, ever existed as anything more than empty space, to return her to the emperor not as an enemy, but as a blank slate. And by the time the veil was lifted, by the time she was escorted back to the surface and returned to her house, she obeyed. Not out of fear, which would have left room for rebellion, but because she genuinely believed rebellion was beneath her, a thing meant for people stronger than her, which she no longer considered herself to be. The veil didn't break bodies. It broke the fundamental sense of self that allowed resistance to exist. The empire didn't talk about these women afterward. They returned quieter, more compliant, their eyes distant. They attended functions but rarely spoke. They followed orders without question. They became shadows of themselves, present but not quite there, because to speak of them was to acknowledge the emperor's favorite weapon, and to acknowledge it was to fear it. When Seraphine was summoned, she knew immediately what it meant. The sealed decree arrived at her townhouse at dawn, carried by 3 masked attendants in black lacquer. The seal bore the emperor's personal mark, the 13-pointed star that signified absolute authority. Her household staff watched in frozen horror. Seraphine read the decree once, her face betraying nothing. Then she folded it carefully, tucked it into her sleeve, and turned to her steward. "Send word to my father. Tell him." She paused. "Tell him I'll be away for a time." "My lady, do as I say." She walked to her chambers, changed into simple traveling clothes, and returned to the entrance hall. She didn't pack anything, didn't say goodbye, didn't resist. She walked with her head held high, a gesture that annoyed Thalarius enough to smirk when he heard about it later. Her attendants, masked in black lacquer, never touched her. They didn't need to. They simply walked, and she followed, maintaining the fiction that this was voluntary. The streets were empty at that hour. No one saw them pass. No one would testify to having witnessed anything. They descended into the palace through a servant's entrance, then deeper still, into corridors Seraphine had never seen despite her years navigating court politics. The air grew colder. The light dimmed. The sounds of the waking palace faded above them. Finally, they reached a door of ancient oak bound with iron. It opened silently. The veil chamber was colder than she expected. No torches. Only pale lanterns that cast a washed, colorless glow, making everything look flat and unreal. The walls were bare stone. The floor was smooth. There was a simple cot, a plain table, nothing else. One of the masked attendants gestured toward the center of the room. Seraphine stepped inside. The door closed behind her with a sound like a tomb ceiling, and the silence began. At first, Seraphine mocked it. She had expected torture, expected pain, expected something she could resist with the force of her will. Instead, she found herself in an empty room with nothing to fight against. She demanded answers. "Under what charges am I held?" Silence. "By what authority does the emperor?" Silence. "I demand an audience with..." Silence. The masked attendants entered once, placing food on the table. She tried to speak to them. They moved around her as if she were merely part of the architecture. Their eyes, visible through the mask's narrow slits, looked through her rather than at her. She tried blocking their path. They waited, patient as stones, until she moved. "This is absurd," she said to the empty room. "This is childish." Her voice sounded strange. In the dead air of the chamber, it didn't echo. It simply stopped, as if absorbed by the walls themselves. She ate the food mechanically. It was bland, designed to sustain rather than satisfy. Then she lay on the cot and tried to sleep. In the darkness, she heard nothing. Not even her own breathing seemed to make sound. Seraphine woke disoriented. Had she slept for an hour? 8 hours? There was no way to tell. The light in the chamber was exactly the same. She began trying to keep track of time, counting her heartbeats, marking patterns on the wall with her fingernail. But the stone was too hard, wouldn't scratch. And her heartbeat seemed to change rhythm, faster and slower, impossible to use as a clock. The attendants came twice, or was it 3 times, with food. She tried different approaches with them. Reason: if you don't acknowledge me, you're complicit in injustice. Nothing. Pleading: please just tell me why I'm here. Nothing. Anger: cowards, face me like humans. Nothing. Their masks reflected the pale lamplight. They moved with practiced efficiency, performing their duties as if she were invisible. By the second meal, or what she thought was the second meal, she stopped trying to engage them. Time was becoming meaningless. Seraphine tried to meditate, a practice she'd learned from an Eastern scholar who'd visited court. She focused on her breathing, on her body, on the sensation of existing. But the silence became suffocating. In normal life, there's always sound. Distant voices, wind, the creak of buildings settling, birds' footsteps, her own clothes rustling. Here, there was nothing. The silence was so complete it felt like pressure against her ears. She tried singing just to hear something. Her voice came out weak, and without an echo it sounded foreign. It sounded like someone else's voice, disconnected from her body. She sang a folk song her mother had taught her, then a court ballad, then anything she could remember. But her voice grew hoarse and the songs felt meaningless without anyone to hear them. She stopped. Seraphine spent what felt like hours studying her hands. They were her hands, certainly. She could feel them, move them, watch them respond to her will. But they looked strange to her. Had her fingers always been that long? Had that scar always been there? Without mirrors, without anyone to reflect her existence back at her, she was beginning to feel less certain about her own physical form. She tried to remember what she looked like. Dark hair, gray eyes, a narrow face. But the details were slipping. When she closed her eyes and tried to picture herself, the image was indistinct, like trying to remember a dream upon waking. The attendants came. She didn't try to speak to them anymore. She watched them move through their duties with mechanical precision, and a terrible thought occurred to her. What if this was all there was? What if there was no plan to release her? What if she would simply exist in this gray, silent limbo forever? She shook her head, trying to dislodge the thought. But it clung. Seraphine stopped speaking altogether. There was no point. Her words died in the air, unheard and unacknowledged. Speaking felt like throwing stones into an endless void. She moved through the chamber like a ghost, pacing, sitting, lying down, standing, in patterns that felt automatic rather than chosen. She was losing her sense of agency. When the attendants brought food, she ate. When they took the tray, she let them. When they entered to adjust the lamps, she moved aside. She was cooperating without deciding to cooperate. The realization should have frightened her. Instead, it felt inevitable, like watching a storm approach from a great distance. Seraphine stopped thinking in full sentences. Her thoughts became fragments, disconnected impressions. Cold, light, stone, empty, waiting, nothing. She sat on the cot for what might have been hours, staring at the wall, and her mind was mercifully quiet. The constant voice in her head, the one that planned, analyzed, strategized, the one that had made her dangerous, had gone silent. She felt peaceful in a terrible way, like a puppet with its strings cut. By the seventh day, something inside Seraphine had fundamentally changed. She no longer remembered why she was here. The memory existed somewhere in her mind, but it felt distant, unimportant, like something that had happened to someone else. She couldn't quite remember the Emperor's face. She could remember that he was important, that he had power, but the details were gone. She couldn't remember her own ambitions, her own plans. They seemed silly now, childish. Had she really thought she could influence anything? Had she really believed herself important? When the masked attendants opened the chamber door on the seventh night, she stood without being told. They led her out, back through the corridors, up toward the surface. She followed. Empty. Obedient. Erased. That was the point. What the Emperor didn't know was that Seraphine, even hollowed, even rattled, even stripped down to her bones of identity, had a core of steel no ritual could erase. It wasn't conscious at first. It was something deeper. A reflex. A fundamental refusal to vanish that lived below language, below thought. On the final night, when the masked attendants opened the chamber to retrieve her, she stepped forward as expected. They led her through the corridors, and then, in a servant's passage near the surface, she heard something. A voice. Real. Human. Speaking actual words to another person. Increased the order for black cloth again. 3rd time this month. How many does that make? 20, they say. Maybe more. 20. The number pierced through the fog in Seraphine's mind like a blade. 20 women. 20 noblewomen subjected to the veil. 20 erasures. And something inside her sparked. Rage. Pure, clarifying rage. The attendants were moving her through a narrow corridor, distracted by the sound of voices ahead. One of them turned to gesture to his companion. Seraphine lunged, not to attack, but to escape. She slipped between them like smoke, her body moving on instinct, and sprinted barefoot down the stone corridor. She didn't know where she was going. She only knew she had to move, escape, had to. The attendants didn't shout. They didn't pursue with violence. Their orders forbade raising alarm. They followed, but she was faster, driven by something primal. Seraphine burst through a door into a servants' hall. Laundry maids looked up, shocked. She collapsed against the wall, gasping, and managed to speak. Her voice was hoarse from disuse, barely a whisper. Veil. The word hung in the air. One of the maids, an older woman with kind eyes, went pale. Sweet gods. Within an hour, the entire servants' quarter was whispering it. By dawn, the nobles knew. By midday, the city was talking. Because Seraphine had done the impossible. She had broken the veil. She had escaped. She had survived. And she had spoken the forbidden word aloud. The revolt wasn't loud. It wasn't violent. It was disgustingly orderly. Because once the nobles knew about the veil, once they understood that their daughters, sisters, wives could simply vanish into silence and erasure, they unified in a way Thalarius had never anticipated. Every fear he'd had about their collective power proved accurate. The noble houses held a private council. No weapons were drawn. No declarations were made. They simply decided, collectively, that Thalarius could no longer be trusted with power. The execution of their decision was elegant. First, the generals were contacted. Many of them had daughters. Many of them had served under General Valior, Seraphine's father. When presented with evidence of the veil, they quietly withdrew their support from the emperor. Second, the senators were approached. They were shown testimony from palace servants, from attendants who had been forced to participate. They saw the list of 20 names, 20 noblewomen, their colleagues' daughters. Third, the provinces were notified. Governors were given a choice: support the emperor or support the reform. Most chose reform. The isolation Thalarius had cultivated so carefully now worked against him. He had no allies, no loyalists, no one willing to die for a man who saw enemies in everyone. On the 7th day after Seraphine's escape, the noble houses marched on the palace. Doors opened to allow them in. Servants had been given orders. Guards stepped aside. Officers had made their choice. Servants watched with relief. They had been complicit unwillingly. Thalarius, cornered in his throne room with only his master of protocols beside him, finally realized the fatal flaw of his punishment. When you erase the identity of noblewomen, you erase the future of the empire. The alliances formed through marriages, the diplomatic connections maintained through social ties, the political intelligence gathered through networks, the inheritance lines that determined succession. He had severed every political thread holding his rule together, one by one, 20 women at a time. And now the whole tapestry was unraveling. Seraphine entered the throne room. She looked like a ghost. Her hair was still wild from the veiled chamber. Her feet were bare and bleeding from running on stone. Her eyes were hollow but burning with clarity. The nobles parted to let her through. She approached the throne, looking up at the man who had tried to erase her. "I didn't break," she said quietly. Thalarius stared at her, and for the first time, he looked small. "You did," she finished. The veil chambers were sealed with iron and concrete. The masked attendants were exiled to the furthest provinces. The master of protocols was stripped of rank and imprisoned. Thalarius was not executed. That would have made him a martyr. Instead, he was given a mercy he had never shown. He was exiled to a comfortable estate on the empire's edge, where he would live out his days in quiet irrelevance. Some called it justice. Others called it cruel irony, to live knowing everyone had moved on without him. The noblewomen who survived the veil underwent years of healing. Physicians attended to their bodies. Philosophers and priests attended to their minds. But the damage ran deep. None of them ever fully returned. Some became quiet shadows of their former brilliance, speaking only when necessary, their confidence shattered. Others became colder, sharper, unwilling to trust anyone again, building walls around themselves that no one could breach. A few, like Seraphine, became political forces of nature, dedicated to preventing any ruler from ever invoking something like the veil again. She worked tirelessly to reform the empire's laws, to establish councils and checks on imperial power, to ensure that what had happened to her and 19 other women could never happen again. She never married. She never had children. She devoted her life to making certain the veil remained buried. The empire shifted, reformed, softened under new leadership. But one truth lingered, haunting every historian who studied that era. Punishments that leave no scars are always the deepest ones. You can heal from a wound. You can set a broken bone. You can recover from exile. But how do you recover from being systematically taught that you don't exist? How do you rebuild a self that was dismantled piece by piece? How do you trust your own perceptions when you've been shown how fragile they are? The 20 women lived. They survived. But they carried the veil with them forever, an invisible weight that shaped every decision, colored every relationship, haunted every quiet moment. 3 centuries later, a historian examining the sealed records of Thalarius IV sat in a lamplit archive, turning pages of testimony with careful, gloved hands. He had spent 5 years researching the veil, tracking down descendants of survivors, reading sealed testimonies, reconstructing what had been deliberately obscured. In the margin of his final manuscript, he wrote, "The veil was not cruelty. It was fear wearing a crown." He paused, considering his words, then added, "No punishment disappears from history. It only waits for someone desperate enough to use it again." He set down his pen, looking at the stack of documents before him. 20 names, 20 women, 20 erasures that had nearly broken an empire. And in the margin, almost as an afterthought, he wrote one more line. "The most dangerous weapon is not the one that kills. It's the one that makes you forget you were ever alive." Then he sealed his manuscript, marked it for preservation, and walked out into the sunlight. Behind him, in the archive's cool darkness, the history of the veil waited, silent, patient, ready to teach its lessons to anyone foolish enough to forget them.